Today, we begin a new unit that shifts our focus from the physical structure and motion of the ocean to the organisms that live within it. In the previous units, we explored how the ocean formed, how the seafloor is structured, and how water moves through processes like waves, tides, and circulation. All of these processes create the environmental conditions that marine organisms must live within. In other words, the physics and the chemistry of the ocean establish the stage upon which marine life operates. The ocean contains an extraordinary diversity of organisms, ranging from microscopic photosynthetic cells drifting near the surface to massive whales traveling across entire ocean basins. Some organisms live attached to the seafloor, some swim actively through the water column, and others simply drift with the currents. Despite this diversity, marine organisms can be organized into meaningful categories that help us understand how they function within the ocean system. Classification in marine biology is not simply about naming species. Instead, classification helps us recognize patterns in how organisms interact with their environment. For example, some organisms are adapted to live in the open water column, while others are adapted to life on the sea floor. Some organisms are strong swimmers capable of controlling their movement, while others rely almost entirely on ocean currents for transport. These differences in habitat and movement strongly influence how organisms attain food, avoid predators, reproduce, and disperse through the ocean. One of the major themes that will emerge throughout this unit is that marine organisms are tightly connected to the physical processes of the ocean that we studied earlier. Ocean circulation influences where nutrients accumulate. Light penetration determines where photosynthesis can occur. Temperature and pressure shape the physiological limits of different species. Understanding marine life, therefore, requires us to integrate biology with the physical environment. Today's lecture focuses on the foundational question: how do we classify marine organisms in ways that help us understand their ecological roles in the ocean? Rather than focusing on the enormous taxonomic diversity of marine species, we will focus on functional classifications that group organisms based on where they live and how they move through the ocean environment. When we think about life in the ocean, one of the first things that becomes apparent is the sheer magnitude of biological diversity. Scientists estimate that millions of species may inhabit the ocean, although only a small fraction have been formally described. These organisms range from microscopic bacteria and phytoplankton to massive vertebrates such as sharks and whales. Attempting to understand ocean ecosystems by examining every species individually would be nearly impossible. Because of this complexity, marine scientists often rely on functional classification systems that group organisms according to shared ecological characteristics. These classifications allow us to simplify the overwhelming diversity of marine life into manageable categories that reflect how organisms interact with their environment and with one another. One of the most useful ways to classify organisms is based on their relationship with the ocean environment. Specifically, we can categorize organisms according to where they live and how they move through the ocean. This approach recognizes that movement and habitat strongly influence ecological roles. For example, organisms that drift with ocean currents experience the environment very differently from organisms that actively swim through the water column, or those that live attached to the seafloor. These classifications also help us identify patterns in marine ecosystems. Many ocean processes affect entire categories of organisms simultaneously. For example, changes in ocean circulation can influence the distribution of drifting organisms. Similarly, disturbances to the sea floor may affect organisms that live on or within marine sediment. By grouping organisms according to ecological function, we can better understand how environmental changes influence entire communities. Another reason classification is important is that it allows us to link biological patterns to the physical processes we studied earlier in this course. Ocean currents transport nutrients and organisms across large distances. Light availability limits where photosynthesis can occur. Temperature and pressure gradients influence species distributions. By organizing organisms according to their ecological roles, we can more easily understand how these physical processes shape marine ecosystems. Throughout the rest of this lecture, we will examine the major functional categories used in marine biology to classify organisms. These categories include organisms that drift in the water column, organisms that actively swim, and organisms that live on or within the sea floor. Together, these classifications provide a framework for understanding how marine life is structured throughout the ocean. Marine organisms are commonly grouped into three major ecological categories based on how they move through the ocean and where they live. These categories are plankton, nekton, and benthos. Although these categories may seem simple, they capture some of the most important ecological differences among marine organisms. The first group is plankton. Plankton are organisms that drift with ocean currents and are largely unable to control their horizontal movement. Some plankton may be capable of small vertical movements within the water column, but overall their distribution is strongly influenced by the movement of water masses. Because they drift with currents, plankton often experience large-scale transport across ocean basins. This drifting lifestyle shapes their ecological strategies, reproductive patterns, and lifestyles. The second group is nekton. Nekton are organisms capable of active swimming that allows them to move independently of ocean currents. These organisms can control their position in the water column and often undertake large migrations across vast ocean distances. Fish, squid, marine mammals, and many large invertebrates fall into this category. Because nekton can actively pursue prey and avoid predators, their ecological interactions are quite different from those of drifting plankton. The third group is benthos. Benthos are organisms that live on, within, or attached to the sea floor. Some benthic organisms are permanently attached to substrates such as rocks or coral reefs, while others burrow into sediments or crawl along the seafloor surface. The benthic environment presents very different challenges compared to life in the water column. Organisms must adapt to substrate conditions, sediment structure, and the availability of food particles settling from above. These three ecological categories form the foundation for understanding marine ecosystems. In the next several slides, we'll explore each category in greater detail, beginning with plankton, which play a particularly important role in ocean productivity and global biogeochemical cycles. Plankton represent one of the most important groups of organisms in the ocean, despite the fact that many of them are microscopic and invisible to the naked eye. The defining characteristic of plankton is their inability to swim against ocean currents. While some plankton possess small structures such as flagella or cilia that allow limited movement, these motions are generally insufficient to overcome the horizontal transport created by ocean circulation. Because plankton drift with currents, their distribution is strongly shaped by physical ocean processes. Surface currents, vertical mixing, and water mass movements can transport plankton across large regions of the ocean. As a result, plankton communities often reflect the physical characteristics of the water masses in which they occur. Plankton are particularly abundant in the upper layers of the ocean where sunlight penetrates the water column. This region, often referred to as the euphotic zone, provides the light energy required for photosynthesis. Many planktonic organisms are photosynthetic, meaning they convert sunlight and dissolved nutrients into organic matter. These photosynthetic plankton, known as phytoplankton, form the base of most marine food webs. In addition to phytoplankton, the plankton community includes a wide variety of animals, collectively known as zooplankton. Zooplankton feed on phytoplankton and other small organisms, transferring energy from primary producers to higher levels of the food web. Many fish species, especially during their larval stages, depend heavily on zooplankton as a food source. The ecological importance of plankton extends far beyond marine food webs. Through photosynthesis, phytoplankton play a major role in the global carbon cycle, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and incorporating it into organic matter. This process links ocean biology to the broader Earth system and influences climate on a planetary scale. Although plankton are often discussed as a single group, they are actually include several distinct categories of organisms that perform different ecological roles. Understanding these differences is essential for understanding how marine ecosystems function. The first major category is phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are microscopic photosynthetic organisms that use sunlight, carbon dioxide, and dissolved nutrients to produce organic matter through the process of photosynthesis. In this way, phytoplankton function as primary producers, meaning they generate the organic material that supports the rest of the marine food web. Major groups of phytoplankton include diatoms, dinoflagellates, and cyanobacteria. Despite their small size, phytoplankton collectively account for a significant fraction of global photosynthesis. The second major category is zooplankton. Zooplankton are animals that drift within the water column and feed on other organisms. Some zooplankton are microscopic, while others can reach several centimeters in length. Common examples include copepods, krill, jellyfish, and larval stages of many marine animals. Zooplankton occupy a wide range of trophic positions within the marine food web, often serving as the primary consumers that transfer energy from phytoplankton to larger predators. A third important component of the plankton community is bacterioplankton. These microscopic bacteria play a critical role in recycling nutrients within the ocean. When organisms die or release waste products, bacterioplankton break down organic material and convert it back into dissolved nutrients that can be reused by phytoplankton. This recycling process is essential for maintaining productivity in marine ecosystems. Together, these different types of plankton form a complex and dynamic community that drives many of the biological processes occurring in the ocean. In later lectures, we will examine how plankton populations change through time and how environmental conditions influence plankton dynamics. In contrast to plankton, which drift with the ocean currents, nekton are organisms capable of strong directed swimming. This ability allows them to move independently of water movement and control their position within the ocean environment. Because nekton can swim actively, they can pursue prey, avoid predators, and migrate across large distances. Nekton include many of the marine animals that people most readily recognize, such as fish, squid, marine mammals, and some large crustaceans. These organisms often occupy higher levels of the marine food web, feeding on plankton or smaller nektonic species. Their mobility allows them to exploit food resources across wide areas of the ocean. One important feature of many nektonic organisms is their ability to undertake large-scale migrations. Some species travel thousands of kilometers across the ocean basins in search of food, suitable breeding habitats, or favorable environmental conditions. For example, certain tuna species migrate across entire ocean basins, while some whales travel between polar feeding grounds and tropical breeding areas. Because nekton are strong swimmers, their distribution is not solely determined by ocean currents. However, physical ocean processes still influence nekton in many important ways. Ocean temperature, oxygen concentration, and productivity patterns often shape the regions where different species can survive and thrive. Understanding nekton or nektonic organisms is important because they often represent the upper levels of marine food webs and play key roles in transferring energy through marine ecosystems. The third major ecological category of marine organisms is benthos, which refers to organisms that live on, within, or attached to the sea floor. The benthic environment includes an enormous diversity of habitats ranging from shallow coastal reefs to the deepest ocean trenches. Some benthic organisms are sessile, meaning they remain permanently attached to a substrate. Examples include sponges, corals, and many types of algae. These organisms rely on water movement to bring food particles or nutrients to them. Because they cannot move, they must be well adapted to the local environmental conditions of their habitat. Other benthic organisms are mobile and can crawl or burrow through sediments. Examples include crabs, sea stars, worms, and many mollusks. These organisms interact closely with the seafloor sediments, feeding on organic material that accumulates on or within the substrate. The benthic environment plays a critical role in ocean ecosystems because many important biological and chemical processes occur there. Organic matter produced in the upper ocean often sinks toward the seafloor, providing a food source for benthic communities. In addition, benthic organisms contribute to the recycling of nutrients by breaking down organic material and releasing nutrients back into the water column. Because the seafloor environment varies widely in depth, temperature, pressure, and substrate type, benthic organisms have evolved a remarkable variety of adaptations that allow them to survive under very different conditions. In addition to ecological classifications such as plankton, nekton, and benthos, marine organisms, particularly plankton, can also be categorized according to their size. Size plays a critical role in determining how organisms interact with their environment, including how they obtain nutrients, how they are consumed by predators, and how quickly they grow and reproduce. Scientists often divide plankton into several size-based categories. Picoplankton are extremely small organisms, typically less than 2 micrometers in diameter. Nanoplankton are slightly larger, while microplankton include organisms large enough to be easily observed under a microscope. The largest plankton are megaplankton that reach above 20 centimeters in size and can easily be seen by the naked eye. Each size category interacts differently with the surrounding environment. Small plankton cells have a very high surface area to volume ratio, which allows them to absorb dissolved nutrients efficiently from the surrounding water. This characteristic gives them an advantage in nutrient-poor regions of the ocean, where nutrients are scarce and competition for resources is intense. Larger plankton cells, on the other hand, have different ecological strategies. Some form chains or colonies that help them remain suspended in the water column. Others store nutrients internally during periods when nutrients are abundant. By understanding the size structure of plankton communities, scientists can gain insight into the productivity and nutrient dynamics of different ocean regions. One of the most fascinating aspects of marine biology is that the categories we discussed earlier, plankton, nekton, benthos, are not always permanent identities for an organism. Instead, many marine species move between these ecological categories during different stages of their life cycle. This means that the plankton community is not composed only of organisms that remain plankton their entire lives. It also includes the early developmental stages of many animals that will eventually become benthic or nektonic adults. A common example involves organisms that live on the seafloor as adults but begin life as planktonic larvae. Many marine invertebrates, such as corals, sea stars, crabs, mollusks, and numerous worms, follow this pattern. Fertilization is often external and takes place in the water column. The resulting embryos develop into very small larval stages that drift in the water column as part of the plankton community. These larvae are often microscopic and possess structures that help them remain suspended in the water column, allowing them to be transported by currents. During this period, they feed, grow, and develop while drifting through the ocean. Eventually, these larvae undergo a process called settlement. Settlement occurs when a larva leaves the planktonic environment and attaches to or burrows into the seafloor, where it begins developing into its adult body form. This transition represents a major ecological shift. An organism that once drifted with currents now becomes a bathyc organism interacting directly with the seafloor environment. This life cycle strategy provides important ecological advantages. By spending part of their life drifting in the plankton, organisms can disperse far from their place of origin. Ocean currents can transport larvae across considerable distances, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. This dispersal helps species colonize new habitats and maintain genetic connections between populations that may be separated geographically. Without this dispersal stage, many marine species would be far more limited in their geographic range. Fish provide another example of this life cycle connection. Many fish species produce eggs that hatch into tiny larval fish that initially behave much like plankton. At this stage, the larvae are weak swimmers and are largely transported by currents. As they grow and develop stronger swimming ability, they gradually transition into nectonic lifestyle of the adult fish, allowing them to actively control their movement through the ocean. These life cycle connections demonstrate that the ocean ecosystem is highly interconnected. The plankton community serves not only as a group of drifting organisms, but also as a nursery environment for many species that will later occupy completely different ecological roles. As a result, processes that affect plankton, such as ocean circulation, temperature changes, or nutrient availability, can have cascading effects on the distribution and survival of many other marine organisms. Understanding these connections will become increasingly important as we move forward in this unit, particularly when we begin examining plankton dynamics and food webs. Marine biodiversity is not distributed evenly across the ocean. Different regions support different types of organisms depending on environmental conditions such as light availability, nutrient concentrations, temperature, and habitat structure. Coastal environments are often among the most productive regions of the ocean. Shallow waters allow sunlight to reach the seafloor, enabling the photosynthesis by both phytoplankton and benthic algae. In addition, coastal zones frequently receive nutrient inputs from rivers, upwellings, and tidal mixing. These conditions support dense populations of organisms and complex ecosystems. The open ocean, by contrast, covers vast areas but often contains relatively low concentrations of nutrients. In these regions, plankton communities dominate the biological structure of the ecosystem. Although individual organisms may be small, their collective productivity supports a wide range of marine life. The deep ocean represents another distinct environment characterized by darkness, cold temperatures, and high pressure. Despite these extreme conditions, specialized organisms have evolved to survive in these habitats. Many deep-sea organisms rely on organic matter sinking from the surface ocean as their primary food source. Understanding how marine organisms are distributed across these different habitats will help us interpret patterns of productivity, food webs, and ecosystem structure throughout the ocean. Okay, so today we established a framework for thinking about marine life by classifying organisms according to where they live and how they move within the ocean environment. We saw that plankton drift with currents, nekton actively swim through the water column, and benthic organisms live on or within the sea floor. These categories help simplify the enormous diversity of marine organisms and allow us to understand how different groups interact within ocean ecosystems. One key idea emerging from today's lecture is that not all organisms contribute equally to the functioning of marine ecosystems. Some groups, particularly plankton, play disproportionately large roles in driving biological processes in the ocean. In the next lecture, we will build directly on this idea by examining primary production and nutrient availability in the ocean. We will explore how microscopic phytoplankton use sunlight and dissolved nutrients to produce organic matter and why this process ultimately provides the energy that supports nearly all marine food webs.